皆様お待たせいたしました。
Thank you very much for your patience. We would now like to start the program of day one. Living. We will be welcoming guests from around the world who love the waterfront, believe in its potentials in driving city revitalization. We would now like to welcome Dr. Kai-Uwe Bergmann for keynote lecture. Professor Shin Murakami of Sugiyama University of Sugiyama University will introduce the keynote speaker. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I am Murakami of Sugiyama University. CANAL art and waterfront themed forum is being co-organized by CANAL art, and I'm one of the directors of the organizer. It is of great pleasure for me to introduce the keynote speaker, Dr. Bergmann. There is a reason that I was selected as the person to introduce him. Under the pandemic, the world has been locked down. But before the pandemic, I routinely used to take 10 or more international business trips. And in 2009, I went to Copenhagen to research housing complex. And on that occasion, I had an opportunity to visit BIG. Back then, BIG was still fledgling, even though it is now a renowned major company. Back in 2006, VM House, an innovative housing complex, was first awarded a prestigious award. And it was the very first big project of BIG, suggesting that it is such a rising star in the industry. And Mountain Dwellings is another housing complex that was designed and engineered by BIG. And to this day, I have considered it as a very important material for a textbook, and Mountain Dwellings was introduced in a textbook that I compiled. On that occasion, I truly felt that BIG is a firm that is so promising, full of potentials. And I was impressed by its potentialities. It was a firm that has a library corner that has lots of manga and animations or cartoon books. And it also had a kanji, meaning big, put on the wall. And he told me what the kanji meant to me, which I didn't have to be lectured about that kanji. But that was quite symbolic of the motto of BIG. In over 20 countries across the world, BIG has a range of projects employing several hundreds of professionals. It is now a global name, and Dr. Kai-Uwe Bergmann is the partner of BIG. He is one of the principal members of the firm. heading several hundreds of engineers across the world. In 1969, Kai was born in Germany, in fact. In 2006, when BIG was first awarded its first big prize, and that was the year when he joined BIG, or BRK Ingalls Group. And with this, I would like to conclude my introduction of Dr. Bergmann. Thank you very much, Professor. And finally, we would now like to welcome Dr. Kai-Uwe Bergmann. Good morning, Nagoya.
I am going to share my screen. And please tell me if you can see my screen. I will talk to you about how we, with big architecture, are thinking about the planet and the world that we live in from a point of where we are today. We are thinking about the world from COVID and how we can imagine a future for ourselves and our cities, that this is a leap, a moment in history where we can imagine new futures for ourselves and for our children. When we look at history, there are times when we have been in similar situations as we are today. Cholera was also a pandemic, and because of cholera, we actually came from that moment and created the modern day sewer systems that we see in many, many cities today. When we think of a calamity such as 9/11 in America, we also imagine a way of actually that it created a new type of security and a very sort of thinking about how we live in our cities and making sure that our buildings and our public spaces can be protected. And we also have experienced in our history climactic situations such as Hurricane Sandy in New York, which of course knocked out the lights where I lived and where I worked in New York. And from Sandy, we've actually imagined a new future for New York, including the Big U flood protection around the entire city. So we are here at a moment when, for the first time in my life, the whole world has been dealing with COVID, and we can start to imagine how this last year and a half to 2 years will actually start to make us think about our own cities in a different way, and how we can use this moment to think maybe of the Nagoya Canal in a very, very different way. This was just 8-9 years ago when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, and it caused tremendous damage, over $65 billion in damages. And you can see here it was flooding, but it was also making people homeless, and people lost their work, their home, and the entire city was affected by this storm. When you look at what flooded, you go all the way back to 1650, so almost 350, 80 years ago. And the original land mass that was there is what stayed dry. Over the next 380 years, people have been adding to New York progressively by adding land and putting more and more construction out into the water. So what happened in Hurricane Sandy is that the water actually pushed back to its original land formation. And you can see here the gray areas are actually what flooded in New York. And what stayed dry is in the darker color. What we proposed with the Big U is to provide a wall of protection in blue along the coast. And this was very, very important to think about how we could protect the 8 million inhabitants of Manhattan and of New York City against sea level rise and against these issues of water. Many countries around the world have to think about flood protection and how to deal with rivers or even lakes and even coastal flooding. Many cities create temporary structures like here in Germany. But this requires planning. It requires having many weeks of preparation so that you can actually make sure to have a very rigorous and supportive flood prevention. New York City did not have that time. A hurricane moves very, very fast. And so with only a few days of notice, the city was very impacted by the hurricane. After this damage, the city began to reassess how do we actually plan for the future. And a competition was held called Rebuild by Design. And it was run by the New York Mayor's Office with a lot of guidance from Holland and the Netherlands. Because in Holland, you have many, many hundreds of years of dealing with flooding and water issues. So the Rebuild by Design competition allowed for worldwide teams, 120 teams, to imagine what a future would be like where rising sea levels start to impact the life in a city. Here you can see again in dark blue what flooded, and in orange all of the buildings that also were affected. We began our research by listening and talking to people that are living in these neighborhoods that were affected. And what you see here is that there are so many different types of people, different languages, different backgrounds. And there is no one way of providing this flood protection because you have to actually also understand all of the nuances that people have and the way that they live. So we wanted to create a flood prevention system that would celebrate humanity, all of the differences within humanity, and that it was driven by the neighborhoods. So a very different plan in the different sections of New York City. And we would start to celebrate the active life, the sports, the recreation, as much as we would also create the flood prevention. In addition to all of the people and the groups, we also met with federal officials, state officials in New York, and the city of New York. There were over 40 different agencies that all have jurisdictions in this land area. By listening to everyone, listening to the officials, listening to the agencies, and to the people and the residents living there, we developed a plan that would protect, but also offer life and recreation and all of the joys that people have in creating a place that welcomes everyone 99% of the time, because the flooding is of course only happening very small amount of time. And this was a way for us to create something that everyone wants in their backyard. So here you can see, this is on the west side of Manhattan. There's not a lot of room for this protection. So we created a sort of social bench, one that allows for people to sit and take a view over the water. And then when the floods are coming, it protects. So this was both a sculpture, furniture, and protection. We also noticed it was very important to educate, to help the citizens understand what was changing in their cities. So we created a space where one could see where the flood levels had been. And it's a kind of history lesson for people who come to New York for the very first time or who move to New York. So imagine in Nagoya if you have a place on the canal where you can begin to tell the story and the history of the canal and where it's going. So we wanted to take this New York that you see here, but all blacked out, and ensure that the lights would never go off and that the people are safe. So the Big U was a proposal that came out of the competition, getting all of the people around the world to look at Manhattan and to help solve these issues. We call this social infrastructure. Infrastructure is typically designed by engineers, and it's typically designed to provide or serve a purpose. With social infrastructure, we, of course, solve the issue and the challenge of flooding, but we don't forget the humans and also the kind of human qualities that this infrastructure can be, and can also provide a gift or provide a wonderful space for the city. I'm very happy to announce that the first 2.5 miles of the 10 miles is now under construction. The funding has come from the federal government, the state government, and the city. Together, they have funded the ability to protect over 200,000 New Yorkers, all of the New Yorkers living in those buildings next to the coast. And they're providing them a very wonderful recreation space, a green space, one that after COVID, we realize how important our parks and open spaces are, and it also protects. This is the first area that you see here that is being built. Everything in blue was flooded during Sandy. And we have been tasked with protecting this first part. In the smaller map in the left side, you can see the first part in bold white, the line, ESCR. That is the first section that will be built. The way that this concept is built is that you can build all of the flood protection in sections, so that if one section is leaking, then it does not flood the entire city, but only that section. Like a ship, when you have a ship and you have the hull broken into different parts, one section can flood, but it won't flood the entire ship. When you're working on these type of projects, it's not only architects. You must look for engineers, for landscape architects, for ecologists, for hydrologists. There are a lot of different needs and specialties that are important. So as we were developing this project, we had over 15 different companies all helping us achieve the goal of making this project succeed. And if you remember, it is so important to listen to your neighbors and the citizens of Nagoya. We have held over 300 meetings over time, listening and then prioritizing. We also, you can see, build many, many different models. So we didn't only show pictures, but we let people actually touch and to show what and how this work would affect them. This communication and this way of listening and retrieving information from everyone is one of the most important aspects of this kind of work. Here is the client. In this case, it is 6 different agencies. So this is the Department of Parks, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Protection, Environmental Protection, the Economic Development Corporation, and the Department of City Planning. This was all structured underneath the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency. This was the first time in many generations that so many different public agencies work together. Sometimes these agencies have very different opinions about what should be done. Parks is very different from Transportation Department. So you have to work with a lot of different perspectives. The park itself, this 2.5 miles, is about 60 acres. And we've shown you here the different parks and their sizes from the west side to Central Park to the south side and to Governor's Island and the High Line, which I'm sure you all know. So it's a very large park. When the Big U is completely built, it will be one of the largest green spaces in the entire Northeast. Here is what will be built in the first phase, and this will be completed by 2026. We've created a lot of different program spaces, some of which are fields, sports fields for soccer and baseball and football, and some are for performance, like theater performances, whereas others are just for relaxation. And you can see that we build bridges from the park over to where the residential community is. It's very important, as we designed this park, that it was for all ages, older as well as younger. And we have many different places and locations for activities for both the young and the old. Here you can see another bridge that brings you across the roads over to the park. And again, you have recreational fields, you have landscape, and this is all built up over 16 feet above the water to protect for the next 100 years on sea level rise. This is another bridge that is the Williamsburg Bridge crossing from Brooklyn into Manhattan. And this is where the park sometimes gets quite skinny. Sometimes it's fat and there's a lot of space, but sometimes it can get quite narrow. And this is again a view of what it looks like 99% of the time. And here's a view of what it looks like when there's a storm event. And it's this landscape that performs, a landscape that really looks to protect. And if the city and the residents see how it protects them, then this is the success of this park. And this is, of course, just the first section of the entire Big U. So right now, the city is actually working on the other sections and planning and designing. And we hope in the next 10 to 15 years, all of the different sections will be under construction and it will be soon complete. Here you can see the other sections below the ESCR section on the right, the yellow line, moves into the orange Two Bridges section, moves into the purple Financial District section, over to the blue, the Battery Park section. All of these sections are currently in design. There are a lot of climate hazards, not only sea level rise, but we, of course, also have storms which push the water into the land. We also have the flooding that occurs when the rain is hitting all of the rooftops and all of the asphalt, and the rain is moving also to the coast. So it's really about many different ways of flooding, from the natural rising of the oceans to the wind pushing the water into the bay to the rain that is falling from the skies. And we evaluated all of these different forces, the rain coming down, the water pushing up, and the sea coming in. You have to look at this dynamically, and you can basically model these kinds of events. And when we looked at the future of New York and the future of sea level rise, we began to map out what is most important to protect. So we have the buildings, we have the subsurface, meaning what's under ground. We have mobility, the streets and the sidewalks, and we have the public realm, the parks and the spaces in between the buildings. So all of this has to be funded, and we have to create the right policy in the city for you to think about the buildings, the below ground, the streets, and the parks. And then you begin to see how you can actually impact these different areas. So we modeled many of these different approaches and looked at inexpensive ways, affordable ways, and more intensive ways, and ways that would also be perhaps more expensive. We looked at that all the way across all of the buildings. And then we began to make suggestions to the city. Perhaps you move your mechanical equipment from the basement to the second floor. You then begin to sort of see how you can keep the water out of a building. You create better stormwater systems below ground. You create areas that can flood and that would then take the water and discharge it over time. Or you can create outward flood protection, and flood protection that becomes a berm or a larger protection. And all of these things can work together. So this is also being proposed, which is a much longer outward bound protection between the buildings and the water. So when you then assess the benefits, the feasibility and the construction, and then of course the financial considerations, that is how you then assess which of these ideas are best for you. And you look at them from a building level, because of course the owners of the buildings and the property can do things on their own sites, and which things are on a city level or a district level, and which are the ones that the city has the ownership of and can make changes. So we realized that really the city is where we can make the most change. And the plan that we have for New York, Lower New York, is a way of extending the New York City boundary further out into the water so that we have more land to protect the city. This is the current sort of section of Lower Manhattan. The buildings come to the water and right away the water is there. So we propose to Manhattan to create a land berm, which is raising towards the edge of the water. And we would finance it through smaller buildings that are on top of the new land and territory that we've created. And this is now going through a kind of review process with the city. And they are thinking how they could implement this protective sort of addition to Manhattan. So here you can see the real Manhattan is on your right, those white buildings, and the sort of future Manhattan is to your left, and the future sort of construction of the land to protect against sea level rise. And this is our view for the future of Manhattan, which also creates a lot of green roofs. Because if the rain is coming down from the sky, then the green roofs will keep the rain and it will evaporate by itself passively. And that will reduce the amount of water in our streets and along the coast. So this proposal was actually built into a 3D model and into a physical model. And all of the stories of the different people telling us about what their dreams are were on the walls. And we showed a combination of stories and storytelling together with this model. And we called it Humanhattan. That Manhattan was thinking of a humane way of dealing with climate change. This is also very well discussed and presented in a book called Too Big, Rebuild by Design, a Transformative Approach to Climate Change. And the author is Henk Ovink, who was the leader for the city to help us with this project. That is sort of a look into the flood protection of New York City, which we called social infrastructure. I have now another couple of projects that look at different infrastructure, but also always from a social aspect. This project we call BQP, Brooklyn Queens Park. But what it actually is a three sort of story transportation corridor. So in the 1950s, they built 3 levels of streets and then a park on top. When we go into the history of Brooklyn, this is the Brooklyn Bridge on your left, you can see that there was a natural hill and there were homes above and there were warehouses below by the water. And in the 1950s, the 3-level road was constructed with the park on top. This infrastructure is now falling down or is decaying very, very quickly because everything needs repair. You can see that we're talking about 8 lanes of traffic. So it's a very important road in New York. We propose to actually extend the 2 lanes that you see there on the ground and to push into the park on the right so that we could actually take 6 of those lanes and place them underground and put a park above and have an added light rail that would add to the transportation of this corridor. And then the actual structure that was the roads turns into a park. This is for us, again, a way of dealing and answering the infrastructure needs, but doing it in a socially humane way. So this is what we would actually start to look at. A park that reconnects the houses above with the waterfront below. And we feel that this is going back to the original kind of Brooklyn landscape as you saw in the old historical rendering, this one. And if we do this in the sort of Brooklyn Heights area where you have the green line, we imagine that those 2.5 miles could extend further with the dashed lines. And here you have a road that's buried and it's cutting one neighborhood off of another neighborhood. Imagine if one built to a top to that trench, and you could actually connect the neighborhoods through a green park. We see that many of the decisions from traffic engineers and water engineers in the 1950s and 60s, we should be rethinking, and we should be finding ways to reconnect the neighborhoods that were cut off from each other. If we do this in the first 2.5 miles, we might actually impact the 17.5 miles from Staten Island all the way to the Bronx. So this is also a way, whatever you do in the canal in Nagoya, you could actually imagine that it has a bigger impact to all of Nagoya and to all of the waterfront in the city and in the region. And finally, I would like to show you a project we did for the Brooklyn Bridge. So everyone knows the Brooklyn Bridge. It was built in the 1860s, and it was a beautiful structure, the longest bridge, and it connected Manhattan with Brooklyn. So this bridge currently is suffering from so many people walking in a very, very narrow area. And so much of the bridge is actually given over to cars. When the bridge was first built, there were only 2 lanes for cars, and the rest were trains and people walking. There were 425,000 people moving across the bridge every single day. Today, there are only 160,000 people going across the bridge because everyone is sitting in a car and the cars are moving so slowly across the bridge. So we've taken something, a bridge that really worked very well for the city, and we've actually gone backwards. How can we find a way to move forwards at this moment? So here is the way that the bridge works today. We have 6 lanes of traffic, and we have a small area for people walking. We propose in the future to actually create 2 lanes for bicycles, 2 lanes for automobiles that are autonomous, and the rest for people, both on the low side and the high side. So we imagine a very different future for the bridge that would get it back to over 300,000 people moving across it every single day, because there's more ways of actually moving across the bridge, either by bicycle or e-bike or walking. And suddenly the bridge that is connecting the city of New York has a way of actually creating a new way of moving through the city. And imagine if every other bridge becomes a bridge for people moving by their feet, moving by a bicycle or an e-scooter, and that then you can keep the car-only bridges also to every other one. We can imagine that the city of New York would start at the Brooklyn Bridge, and then it would sort of feed into Manhattan and into Brooklyn. And this would set off a new way of thinking that there are certain roads that connect people with bicycle and e-scooters that can move quickly down these corridors. And it would create a brand new way of moving through the city of New York. Right now, many people don't use the subway because of COVID, and they are moving themselves through the city by bicycle and e-scooters. And we can imagine that in the future, the streets on the left are where everyone is driving through the streets of Manhattan, and on the right, people are walking. They're using autonomous vehicles and e-scooters, or they're using basic transportation and cars. And we're calling this woven YC, this idea that you can create a variety of movements through the inner city of New York. So imagine coming back, if you've ever been to New York, and coming back and you would see a very different city, one in which there is a lot of movement, a lot of people, the People's Bridge, it's called Brooklyn Bridge. I want to thank you so very much for allowing me to share these projects with you, and I look forward to answering your questions in the next section. I think we're just waiting for someone to come and to help with the questions.
甲斐さん、ありがとう。
Kai, thank you very much. We would now, is it okay to move on to Q&A section? Can we now move on to the Q&A section? Kai, can you hear translation? Can we now start receiving questions? Can you hear me now?
I see a question that has been asked by an anonymous attendee. If someone could translate the question, I'm very happy to answer.
はい、今私の方で、日本語でいただいた質問。
I have received some questions in Japanese, and I will pick some of them, which is to be translated into English simultaneously. And this is how we go.
今質問を実は、裏の事務局が
I have my secretariat selecting some questions, during which period we are welcoming many more questions. Those of you wishing to ask a question can enter questions to the QA box on the screen, and the secretariat will pick some of the questions from the box to be translated in English. As we wait for the entries of the questions, I would like to abuse my right to ask some questions to you. Kai, can I now ask you the question?
There's a question that's in English that I can respond to right away, and maybe
ですね、
someone
事
could.
務局の方はですね、村上
Secretariat,
どうしたらいいですか？僕、英語で質問していいんですか？
is it okay for me to ask an English question? No.
僕、日本語で言うしかないんです。
I must ask question in English, and it needs to be translated. The first question
中川運河に
is about Nakagawa Canal. What potentialities can Nakagawa Canal have? I'm not sure Kai has ever been to Nakagawa Canal in Nagoya, but our venue is very close to Nakagawa Canal.
一定地域中心にあります名古屋市の運河
So if you are to improve the situation around Nakagawa Canal in the center of Nagoya, I would like to welcome your input.
これは、どうしたらいいでしょうか？通訳の方、
Translators? Is it being translated?
ここはルールを破って僕が
Then I should be asking the question in English.
I have a question. Yeah. Could you please advise us, well, what is the future of Nagoya City and the Nakagawa Canal? Do you have some ideas on that?
Yes. I do.
Yeah, please explain about that.
So I think that one has to consider that there are many people who have lived and worked in the canal as it is today. And they have a history and they have a connection to what is there today. And it is very difficult often for someone to see a different alternative vision or alternative future from something that they see today. And so one has to incorporate the needs and the thinking of the way that the waterfront is functioning today. I see this as one needs to take many little steps to take a giant leap. And so it's a very long canal.
Yeah, thank you very much. And there, we have another question
Yes,
from
please.
Christine on the network. Thank you for the talk, Mr. Bergmann. I studied the Rideau Canal, and it's a waterway in Canada that is a mix of both canal sections and their natural rivers and lakes. How do you think architecture and design can help manage flooding and increase climate resiliency in more natural waterways?
It's an excellent
From
question.
Canada,
Yes,
I think.
it's an excellent question. And I think one has to think of anything that we build is contributing to the water movement of that area. And as we build along natural waterways, we should be thinking of our buildings as sponges so that the water that hits the building is actually maintained and kept within the building for irrigation and for other water resources. So if we begin to think of our coastal areas and our watersheds as ecosystems that are all interconnected. So a building isn't just a building on a site. A building is actually viewed as its contribution to a watershed. We will begin to think and design differently. Now, I think much of this is policy. So how a city and how a place sees its waterways. And if you elevate the water system, the natural system, in a way so that you begin to make decisions about your buildings and the zoning and the regulations out of the waterways, this is a very important kind of prioritization of how important water is to us and also how damaging it can be to us. We need to elevate water as both a resource and as a sort of ecological foundation of our buildings and construction.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have a question, right?
Of course.
And I would like to know what percentage of ideas were from city, and what percentage from citizens, and
Yes.
what from architecture.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think that it's the author of these ideas is not one of these elements, but a combination. And in some ways, we as architects, we are like curators in a museum. We are collecting the ideas from the citizens. We are collecting best practices from around the world. We are also, of course, listening to the public officials. And it is our job to prioritize these and to synthesize those ideas into an actionable plan. And by actionable, I mean, we don't want to just create another vision plan that is only going to go on a bookshelf. We want to create an actionable plan with real implementable projects so that the steps can be taken. I said a lot of little steps. You have to think of this as a roadmap of how you will create the kind of vision for implementation. And with Nagoya Canal, I think it's very big. It's very long. There are very many different sections and different qualities. You have to create a vision that respects all of the different areas and the different landowners and the different sort of habitats. There's areas with birds. There's other areas with, with junk and rusting kind of industry. You have to think about all of the qualities and map those out, and then think of little ways that you can make change, so that if everyone is making a little change and everyone is supporting the plan, then you can make a very, very big difference for the city. And this is the idea of the big U. The big U is many little things happening along the 10 miles of coastline. It's not only one design that is followed all the way through. That's the difference between an engineering plan and I think one in which it's more of a human plan for the city.
Okay. Thank you very much. Another question from the net. What do you think about the role that architectural design can play in the future of waterfront and infrastructure construction? What is the role of architecture?
So I think that architecture plays this role of the curator or the conductor, where there's so many different perspectives and so many different kind of agendas. One could be only looking at this from an economic perspective. I need my waterways to move goods and to move industry. One could look at it from an ecological standpoint. I want to make sure that the birds and the fish can thrive and that they come back into an industrial area. And you're dealing with a lot of opposites. So one is proposing a lot more industry, the other is proposing a lot more ecology, and you have to find a balance. You have to find a way that these different policies and these different interests can actually move forward. And in life, actually complexity leads to hybridization and to working together. And it's in those moments of working together, we, with the big U, we have 6 different public agencies, which most often are battling each other and are against each other. And for the first time in 50 or 60 years, we have asked them all to work together with a common vision. That is, I think, as much what the architect is doing than designing and making very, very compelling pictures.
Okay. Next question, right? From Mr. Tani on the net. Thank you, Kai. My concern is, like sea level rise, a plan for up to year 2100 would need to be replaced by a new one for year 2200, and that would require much more cost than planned at the very beginning.
A very good question, because it's true. We need to think of this plan not as the end plan, because this is only a stepping stone. It's the foundation. So you already need to factor in that a next generation or 2 generations from now will add on top. And it's like building a wall. When you build a wall, you have to think about how much weight, how much future expansion the wall must take. And therefore, you cannot build a wall that is so big and so expensive that this generation, my generation, your generation, will be not able to pay for that wall. So you have to find the balance of making something that is achievable. So I say that if you can finance something that is within 15 years or 20 years, then that is an investment that can be made within 1 generation. But you also realize that the future generations must build on top. A good example of this is Holland. Holland, 60–70% of the land is below the ocean or below the water table. And they invested in building polders and building berms and walls to protect against the sea. But the sea is rising. So the polders they built 200 years ago are being added onto. That is the mentality we should be looking at for investing and building now, and also anticipating the investment and the building in the future.
Okay, thank you, Kai. This is the last question. Could BIG join Nakagawa Canal projects in Nagoya?
Yes, we would be very happy to join, and we've been thinking of Nagoya Canal for over a year since this conference has been discussed, and we are working in Japan. Many of you may already know we are involved with Toyota on a project called Woven City, and we have actually opened an office in Tokyo, and we have several of our big employees and staff, Maki, you, that are stationed in Japan, and they are working on projects there. So we are actually local and working very near Nagoya, and in such a way, we would be very, very proud and honored to be able to take the ideas and the best practices that we have developed in Europe, working in Denmark and throughout Europe, and then working in places like New York and Boston, Miami, and San Francisco. Many of those projects have also been related to resiliency.
Thank you very much. 最後に質問で、
The last question. So it was the question about whether BIG could possibly join the Nakagawa Canal project, which he really welcomed. Thank you very much for the QA section. With this, I would like to conclude the QA session. And Professor Shin Murakami, thank you very much for the moderation. And thank you, Dr. Bergmann, for answering all the range of different questions. We look forward to the future of the Big U project. Dr. Kai-Uwe Bergmann, thank you very much. And with this, the keynote speech is to be closed. We will now have a short break. Next session will be starting at 1:15 p.m. Opening discussion number 1, Waterfront Cosmology, Art, Consciousness, and the Future.